All right, without further ado, let's get you into the Q4 2025 meta update for base fossil. I'm ogrehvnds, and let's get started. Okay, a few caveats before we get into this. I'm not going through every deck that's possible in base fossil. There's just not time for that. I don't think it's very useful for our purposes here. Mostly focused on competitive play here. I'm talking about the big 8 or the biggest 8 meta decks. I'm going to cover those archetypes briefly. I'm not going to give a full rundown on what those decks do. There's no deck tech. I'm assuming you have some background knowledge if you're watching this, or if you need a little bit more knowledge, I do have videos where I go a little more into the deck techs on these decks. I'd also want to say I'm no way, shape, or form a statistician. I just try my best, and let's get into it. Okay, so going into Psystall, it's the 8th most played deck. Now that being said, for a lot of our purposes here, I tried to only do matchups that I had at least like 30 plus responses for. That's just not happening for Psystall. I'm not there yet. But for some of the matchups, we do have that data. So Psystall does seem to do well against other stall decks. It's kind of a versatile deck. As you can see here, we can use that grass energy to be a little more aggressive than the other stall decks. And then against the other aggro decks, we can take the stall role ourselves. I'm assuming these numbers are going to go down as this deck gets played more because only some of the best players are playing this deck. It's not seen very much. I would assume those numbers will go down, so take it for a grain of salt, if you will. But right now it seems to do very well against stall. You can take that early aggression into the beginning of the game. You can deprive your enemy of some of that momentum going forward, make them spend some cards they don't want to spend, and then you can close them up in the end of the game. It also has a very decent matchup against Raindance. This seems to be one of the stall decks most susceptible to being Raindanced out. That's probably because you have less basics than a lot of the other stall decks, but still not a bad matchup. Do want a little bit more data on this deck, but actually seems to do very well, as we'll see later. Our 7th most played deck is DFP. That, of course, comes from Dodrio, fighting, in this case, Hitmonchan, and Psychic, usually Mewtwo, and various Psychic accessory mons. Stats seem to be kind of suffering, but it has kind of improved in some of the matchups. It's also very viable. It's won some events, as Psystall has as well. Seems to do very poorly against stall. I'm going to talk about why I think that more later. It does really good against the Drio-based decks, as you can see. DFP versus Rain is also one of the rarest matchups in my books, but I'm thinking it's going to be a pretty poor matchup for DFP. It seems to get pretty blown out by Raindance. But as you can see here, its lowest matchups are obviously against the stall decks, Moltres and Grass. Middling against the Wigglytuff decks. It's kind of where it wants to be. Does really good against Trad. Trad has a very difficult time against this, just because you're hitting multiple of its weaknesses and it has so few pivots. All right, our 6th most played deck is Tradmaker. This one seems to have the biggest fall off of any of the decks. There are kind of 2 variants of this deck. There's either the one that's kind of Magmar Electabuzz or Hitmonchan Electabuzz. I think Hitmonchan Electabuzz is kind of where you want to be, but there are cases for the Magmar variant. I'm thinking this is probably going to get replaced by a similar deck that uses Dodrio instead of Scyther. It just doesn't have enough pivots to keep up in this meta. Pivots are just essential to winning this game anymore. It's just such a fast meta. What this deck wants to do is prey upon Drio and Wigglytuff-based decks for the obvious reasons, running Hitmonchan and Electabuzz. Seems to do fairly poorly against stall. So if you can see on the matchup spread, some of those decks it does most poorly against would be stall decks. There are various, like DFW being in there shouldn't be a thing. I think that will change once you use Dodrio. Once you can pivot a little bit more, you'll have that advantage against Hitmonchan. So I think that will change in the new meta. But does resoundingly well against Wigmar, as you can see above. Solid enough against Raindance, kind of a 50-50 flip. So I'm thinking we're going to see this rise from one of its worst matchups to one of its best once we have Dodrio in there, is my guess. Okay, 5th most played deck is kind of one of the boogeymans of the format. Raindance, this is the deck you have to respect. It's different from all the other decks. I think the numbers on this deck is skewed pretty heavily by like new players jumping in, wanting to play a cool deck. They don't know what they're doing and they jump into Raindance. No hate, I just think that's what's happening. I think it does very well. It has some really polarized matchups, as we're going to see. I don't have enough matchups for DFP and Moltres here yet. Not quite enough. but I'm thinking it does very well against DFP just because it's a little bit slower of a deck that isn't a stall deck, and it seems to do very poorly against Moltres. Maybe a little counterintuitive with that fire in there, but once again, it's a stall deck, and I'll kind of talk about why I think that's happening in my kind of meta update at the end. I also think that this deck is going to be the de facto Wiggly Dodrio X killer, and I think it's going to do very poorly against stall, as we're going to see here. It's horrific against Psystall. Psystall annihilates this. If you're going into a tournament, be aware of this, that if you run into a lot of Psystall or you're expecting that, you could have problems. It does very poorly against Wigmar. Once again, I think that has to do something with the tournament data. A lot of good players go with Wigmar because it's a very reliable, hits a lot of things pretty evenly sort of deck, and they're going to get washed out by Wigmar decks when they're lower playing Raindance players in the tournament. Has a kind of even spread against Grass Stall. Trad has a good handle on it just because of that Electabuzz. That early Electabuzz against the Squirtles is very punishing, and then just annihilates DFW, even with what my data leads to me to believe, where it's kind of lower tier players playing this deck. Just that slower DFW style is not lending well to surviving against Raindance. Fourth most played deck is DFW. That's coming from that Dodrio, fighting, in this case, Hitmonchan and Wigglytuff. It's got a pretty balanced approach to the field, which I like. It, of course, struggles against Raindance, like we said before. For some reason, Wigmar's doing better at that. I think I already said why. I think DFW is going to have a lot more problems with the new Tradmaker, the Neo Tradmaker, than the Tradmaker does now. That Tradmaker has a horrible matchup against DFW. Also keep in mind this deck can beat stall decks in the right hands. I'm going to show you the spread. It looks grim, but it's not that bad when you really look at it. Our bottom matchup is Raindance. Has a huge problem there, as I've already elucidated before. Our stall decks would be our next worst matchup, so think about that. That's 45%. That's not that crazy. That's 5% away from 50%, or 7% respectively. DFP, it has a pretty even matchup against, with those kind of interplays with weaknesses going on there, of course, and resistances. Has a pretty good matchup against Wigmar. That kind of makes sense with the Hitmonchan. Resistance damage to the Wigglytuff. Magmar's not doing that. And then it seems to annihilate Tradmaker decks. For now, anyway, like I said before. Okay, our third most played deck is Wigmar. I've talked about this a couple times. That comes from that Wigglytuff and the Magmar. Of course, using Dodrio as their pivot. Seems pretty balanced. As you can see, a lot of their numbers are close-ish to 50%. That's kind of where we want things to be. Matchup against Psystall and Raindance is interesting. Something to look at when we get a look at those. Look at those. Like Psystall, this is one of the only decks that has a slight lead on Psystall. I don't know if that's where it's supposed to be, or if that's kind of an outlier, but that's pretty interesting and promising considering when we look at Psystall later. So Wigmar definitely has a place in a tournament if you're thinking about that. Also very good against Raindance, so one of the other big decks you usually see at tournaments is Raindance. Not quite sure why, maybe because it's just such a cool deck, people want to play it. So very interesting choice for a tournament. I think, once again, this is going to have a worse matchup against Tradmaker, because Tradmaker is going to go away, but it's already suffering already. But once it has more pivots off Dodrio, I think this gets a little bit scarier. So if we're expecting something like a Neo Maker coming along, something to consider if we're talking about tournaments. So looking at that spread, the Tradmaker's its worst matchup. Very interesting, along with DFW. Like we've talked about before, DFW has a pretty good shot against Wigmar. So once again, a pretty good choice, DFW, in the tournament meta. Stall decks, pretty good, not bad. Fares worse against Moltres and Psystall, which is interesting. Fares pretty poorly against Moltres. I don't know if that's something to do with the Magmars being able to stall out the Wigglytuffs a little better. Not quite sure what's going on there over Psystall, but very interesting. DFP also pretty close to average with it, hitting those important weaknesses on the Wiggly. Psystall, this having a positive matchup against Psystall is huge. It's the only deck that has a better than average matchup against Psystall. I don't know if that's accurate, like I said, but interesting. And then, once again, washing out Raindance. Second most played deck is Moltres, with stall being as good as it is. This should not be that unexpected. I think there will be in the future some sort of schism between the purifiers that are using the Dittos. That seems to be a thing that's evolving. And then the version that splashes a little bit of Psychic for the Duck, Mime, things of that nature. So I will be splitting those up going into the future. I'm also really interested what the Grass Stall versus Moltres matchup is. That one is extremely rare as well. Would be curious to know if grass does well against that, because it could be an anti-stall deck of some sort, even though it is a stall deck. It's a very good deck. I'm kind of interested to see how it also breaks down against Psystall going forward. If we have one that's much better at fighting Psystall, then we're going to have a clear choice emerge. I think that might be the one that splashes Psychic itself. As I always joke about the Psystall singularity, everything becomes Psystall. I think there is a fire deck that splashes Psychic that could be dealing with Psy as well. So looking at the matchup spread, its worst matchup, its only bad matchup is against Psystall, but that's not uncommon for these decks. And it's not by a crazy percentage either. This number was closer before, but it started pulling away again. Has a great matchup against Trad, your Wiggly type decks. Not that different for it. Anything that's using like a Hitmonchan or a Wiggly doesn't seem to bother it all that much. Pretty advantageous for it. Has a really great matchup against DFP. I think that's because of the Mew that you have in there. That Mew is pretty critical to killing rival Mewtwo's, because that is the one way you can lose on this deck, is if Mewtwo loads up. Okay, then our final deck, the big bad itself, Psystall. This is our most played deck. This is a deck we know about far more than any other deck. Once again, I'm saying these grass stall stats will probably fall, but could be very interesting. Also looks like Magmar-based decks are pretty good against Psystall as well. Just being able to smoke screen and kind of reverse stall them and slow them down is interesting. This deck also has the most favorable matchups out of any deck in the format, so really important to know. A deck you're definitely going to be seeing at a tournament, obviously, and it really blows Raindance out of the water. So going through the spread once again, Grass Stall seems to give it fits, just because it is more aggressive, and I think it's losing some of those cards. And then Grass can flip to stalling out, possibly. Those numbers are going to fall, I'm pretty sure. Magmar and Wigglytuff, Wigmar, giving it fits as well. I think that Magmar is a problem for the deck. Being able to poison some of its big Pokemon, being able to smoke screen and buy time can be a problem. And then the Wigglytuff obviously getting the big punches. Has not much of a problem with DFW, obviously kind of flips the other way. I think that weakness to the Psychic is a problem. And then a lot of your Pokemon are also resisting fighting, whether it be your Ghastly or your Scyther. So I think that could be part of the problem there as well. DFP, not much of a problem. I think, once again, it's hitting some of those important weaknesses. DFP, a lot of those things are weak to Psychic, and you have a splash of Psychic or more in there. Moltres, once again, pretty good matchup for it. I'm curious, once again, what happens with the split. Tradmaker is not a problem for this deck. You're just so mobile. You're able to hit a lot of weaknesses. You're able to flop around. You're able to hit removals. It's just very resilient against this deck. And then Raindance is no issue whatsoever. You have so many basics to where you can't get last out, and you can fill your bench. And a lot of your Pokemon have over 60, 70 HP, like your Chanseys and your Lickitungs. Raindance is not that scary for you, and you have Mime to throw in there against Blastoise, so pretty good matchup for it. Now, I think the thing that's interesting is kind of going through the data. I want to kind of change the way that the meta is talked about, the way the matchups work. I think it's more important to talk about this deck instead of archetypes, is the speed at which you're playing this game. Really, what I think wants to happen is the kind of quicker decks, like your Raindance, your what were considered combo-ish decks, your kind of donk decks, your very aggro decks. That'd be in that quadrant up there at the top. Anything that's not using Wigglytuff typically wants to prey upon your Wigglytuff decks. Those are its good matchups. And then your Wigglytuff decks typically want to prey upon your stall decks of various varieties. And then your stall decks are obviously going to blow out your aggressive decks just because they can take their time. So I think this is kind of where we need to start talking about the meta. And I think that data kind of works out. Because if you look at the blind kind of matchups here, all the decks that fall into that kind of stall category are the biggest winners so far. They have that plus 14, plus 7, plus 5%. So those are all over 50%. So just in the blind going into a game, for instance, Moltres has a 55% chance to win a game on average. Then your kind of Wigglytuff based decks, they're kind of slower aggro decks, kind of your mid-range, if you will, style decks, are about average. And those are the ones that want to prey upon your Psystall. And then your biggest losers are your aggro and kind of donk sort of decks, like your Raindance, your DFP, your Tradmaker. Those decks that want to kill the Wigglytuff decks are the biggest losers because the stall decks are taking their percentage and shifting it over there. It would be fairly balanced if stall was less resilient. against the Wiggly style decks, and then it would kind of balance out. Or if the aggressive decks were a little better against the Wigglytuff decks, something to that effect. So that's what's going on there. And it kind of lines up with the sort of theory I have. I don't know if it's kind of a confirmation bias sort of thing, but I think that's the way we need to talk about the game going forward, is that kind of fast, mid-range stall sort of thing. Okay, before we wrap up, I do want to talk about some spicy decks I've run into this league and just kind of grinding on TCG1. The first deck would be this Leedonk deck. This is definitely one of those fast style decks I'm talking about. This is by Ashton. Basically, you want to be buzz-apping to things like Chansey, Hitmonlee, things of that nature, but you want to be able to hit some Pokemon for weakness and kill them instantly. What is interesting about Lee is that it can kill Wigglies and Lickitungs instantly with its jump kick. Not something to scoff at. I feel like the stall decks do far better against this deck than the Wigglytuff decks do. I played against this deck myself a couple times. The Wiggly style decks struggle where the stall decks have a little bit easier of a time. So kind of conforming to that chart once again. Second deck I want to talk about is this kind of Zam stall deck by Altair. The idea being you kind of set up Alakazam, you're siphoning damage off to the Chanseys, and then you're using Magmar as kind of an aggro stall piece because it can hold people off with Smokescreen and reach out with Poison, so it gives you some options. A little bit more resilient than you'd think. Typically, Zam decks aren't that great, but I think this is maybe one of the better versions that I've seen so far. I'm not saying either of these decks are going to break top 10, probably, although Leedonk has taken a league. It had some good matchups against Wiggly-style decks in that win of its. Viable, but maybe not top 10. But interesting. Finally, talking about the kind of Neo Maker I think is coming along this list. I was kind of talking with Ophthalmoscope. This is something he was piloting. I've tried it as well. I got a second place with this deck as well. Like I said, you typically want to be killing Wiggly decks with this because you are hitting their Wigglytuffs or Jigglypuffs with Hitmonchan, and then you're hitting their birds with Electabuzz. So gives them kind of fits, really struggles against stall. There's not much you can do against it. I mean, you can, and you can beat stall, but I'm like, that's not where you want to be, okay? So once again, hearing that theory, it's a fast deck, wants to beat a medium deck, struggles with slow stall decks. I think just the end of being able to shift off Scyther is done. This meta's too fast. You have to have pivots to win this game. And that's one of the biggest problems that Raindance has right now, is that it doesn't have the ability to pivot. So just too quick for Tradmaker, so rest in peace. And that pretty much does it. So any questions, hit them down below. Hit me on the Discord, links down below. Any ideas for videos going forward? I'm going to have more time with December coming up, so if you got any ideas, drop them down below, and I hope to see you around playing some Pokemon.